My fiance told me she was leaving the country forever, claiming she needed a fresh start. But when I checked her passport and noticed the signed documents on our kitchen table, I realized she had already sold everything we owned together without telling me that. I 33M saw the documents on a quiet Tuesday morning when the sunlight hit the kitchen table just right, revealing the stack of papers that had somehow been left in plain sight. I didn't have to read them to know what they were at first glance. The familiar stamps, the bold letters, and the signatures at the bottom all screamed finality. My fiancée, Hannah, had told me she was leaving the country for a fresh start, saying she needed space, time to figure herself out, but seeing these papers made it painfully clear that she hadn't just been talking about a break. She had already made the decision for both of us, liquidating our shared life without so much as a conversation. I remember the morning vividly. I had woken up later than usual, groggy, with the scent of coffee brewing in the corner of the kitchen. Hannah's voice wasn't there, no casual greeting or clattering of dishes like she usually did when she moved around the apartment. My eyes landed on the table, where a pile of paperwork had been meticulously arranged. At first, I thought it might be some legal formality for her new job, maybe some travel documents, but the top page stopped my heart cold. It was the property transfer forms, signed and notarized, along with the title to our car, and what I later realized was the list of bank accounts she had emptied. I could feel my stomach twist, the heat rising in my chest as my mind struggled to reconcile her words with the reality in front of me. We had been together for almost 6 years, living in an apartment we had decorated together, planning a wedding, and talking about buying a house someday. The idea that she could make such sweeping decisions alone seemed impossible at first, like a hallucination or a cruel trick of the light. I grabbed the top sheet, almost shaking, and flipped through it, seeing my name crossed out or completely absent, replaced with her initials in bold ink. Every page made my pulse quicken. The bills, the accounts, the furniture we had picked out together, all gone, signed over, transferred, or sold without my knowledge. It felt like I had been erased from the life we had built together, and the betrayal cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. I sat down at the table, trying to calm the rising tide of panic and anger. I felt numb, like someone had removed my ability to process emotions normally. The documents were official, legal, and binding. I realized that there was nothing I could do to reverse the steps she had already taken. A cold thought crossed my mind. She hadn't just left, she had rewritten our entire shared reality to suit herself. I tried to remember the past few weeks, the little inconsistencies, the hurried phone calls, the vague excuses for trips she claimed were work-related. They all made sense now, pieces of a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight. Hannah came home around noon, smiling as if nothing had happened, humming a tune from some song I didn't recognize. She carried her suitcase and set it down by the door, looking at me expectantly. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, but the words lodged in my throat. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way to salvage the pieces of what we had, but the evidence on the table refused to let me ignore reality. She was calm, collected, almost casual, asking if I had seen the documents she had left for me to look at, a phrase that made my blood run cold. It was clear she had intended for me to discover it, as if the act of realization was punishment enough. I noticed then how much planning had gone into this. She hadn't just made a rash decision, everything had been orchestrated. The timing of her conversations, the way she mentioned leaving the country in vague terms, the smiles, the excuses, all of it was part of the plan. She had secured her flight, signed the contracts, transferred ownership, and emptied our joint accounts before I even knew something was amiss. It was meticulous, calculated, and devastatingly effective. I felt a mix of betrayal, disbelief, and a quiet, simmering anger that I could barely contain. The woman I thought I knew, the one I had planned my future with, had been living a different agenda all along. I sat back in my chair, staring at the documents, feeling the world shift beneath me. The apartment suddenly felt hollow, empty of the shared life we had imagined. Every memory, every plan, every conversation suddenly seemed like it had been part of a farce I hadn't realized I was participating in. I thought about our wedding plans, the weekends spent furniture shopping, the arguments over paint colors and living arrangements, all decisions we had made as a team. Now it was clear that for her, the partnership had been conditional, or perhaps even an illusion. I felt an unfamiliar mixture of grief and disbelief, mourning the life that had been stolen from me without a word. I knew I had to act fast, but I also knew that nothing I did now could undo what had already been done. The property was legally transferred, the accounts emptied, the assets sold. I couldn't rewind time or force her to tell me the truth before she acted. I felt trapped between shock and the necessity of planning my next steps. I needed clarity, I needed evidence, and most of all, I needed to protect whatever remnants of my life she hadn't touched yet. But the sense of trust that had been the foundation of our relationship had been obliterated, leaving behind only a raw awareness of betrayal that I would carry with me for a long time. After staring at the documents for what felt like hours, I finally gathered the courage to confront Hannah. She was in the bedroom, tossing clothes into a carry-on bag, humming as if nothing had changed. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm, but I could feel the tension building in my chest as I approached her. I asked her directly why she had sold our apartment, transferred our car, emptied the accounts, and made plans to leave the country without telling me. Her smile faltered slightly, but only for a moment. Then she turned to me, still calm, almost proud, and said she needed a fresh start, that she had been feeling trapped, and that she thought it was best to handle everything quickly. She avoided eye contact, careful with her words, almost rehearsed. I could barely process her reasoning. It wasn't a sudden mistake or an accident. This had been deliberate, thought through, and executed with precision. The realization hit me in waves. Every little lie over the past few months, the sudden work trips, the vague comments about needing space, all part of the same plan. My chest tightened. My hands trembled slightly, and I felt an overwhelming mix of anger, grief, and disbelief. How could someone you loved and trusted for years erase a shared life like this without even giving you a conversation? The apartment, the car, our savings, all gone, liquidated, gone without any warning. She tried to explain, insisting that she had done it for both of us, that she couldn't continue living in the old life, that she needed to take control. But her words sounded hollow, rehearsed, almost cruel in their calmness. I realized that this wasn't just about leaving or starting over. It was about control, about reshaping reality to fit her desires while erasing mine. Every attempt at justification made it worse. Her fresh start was built on the destruction of the life we had built together. She wasn't asking for my understanding, she was demanding my compliance, expecting me to accept a life that no longer existed. I felt trapped, like the floor had been pulled out from beneath me. We had shared so much: our routines, plans for marriage, conversations about a house, dreams of travel, arguments over furniture and paint colors. Everything that had seemed mutual, collaborative, was now revealed as entirely one-sided. She had taken all of our shared assets, leaving me with only memories. My mind raced with questions. Had she ever truly loved me, or had I been living in an illusion she meticulously maintained? The trust I had placed in her felt like it had been dismantled brick by brick, leaving me standing alone amid the rubble. I tried to reason with her, to find some middle ground, to negotiate. I asked if she had considered my feelings, if she could have at least discussed her plans with me before taking irreversible steps. She seemed almost offended by the question, brushing it off as if my input didn't matter. Her focus was entirely on her own liberation, on her exit plan, as though our 6 years together were merely an obstacle. To be clear, I realized then that she had planned her departure carefully, timing everything to avoid confrontation until the last possible moment. Every excuse, every diversion over the past months had been a layer of strategy. The more I processed the reality of it, the more isolated I felt. I couldn't tell anyone yet, not without making myself vulnerable. This betrayal was intimate, almost surgical in its precision. She hadn't left impulsively. She had methodically dismantled our life together and positioned herself to step away with everything intact. My heart felt heavy, my thoughts spiraling. The apartment which had been my sanctuary now felt alien. Every corner, every detail reminded me of what had been erased and replaced by her unilateral decisions. I spent the next hours pacing the apartment, rereading the documents over and over, trying to find some loophole, some opportunity to reverse the damage. But everything was airtight. The signatures were legitimate, notarized, the accounts had been cleared, the apartment had been sold. It was final. The shock slowly began to give way to a cold, simmering anger. This wasn't just abandonment. It was theft, betrayal, erasure of a shared life. She had treated our history like property she could dispose of, and the depth of the manipulation became painfully clear. When she finally finished packing and zipped her suitcase closed, she looked at me and said she would leave in the morning. No apologies, no hesitations, no acknowledgement of the damage she had done beyond a brief, almost mechanical expression of regret that sounded more like a formality than genuine emotion. I realized that whatever bond we had shared, whatever plans we had made, was entirely dependent on her willingness to honor it. And now it was gone. I understood that she had never truly considered our partnership equal, that her love, if it could be called that, had been conditional, strategic, and self-serving. As night fell, I sat alone in the apartment, staring at the empty space where our shared life had existed. The silence was suffocating. I went from grief to rage to numbness, feeling a cascade of emotions I couldn't contain. I thought about our friends, our families, and the facade she had maintained. No one had known the extent of her plans. I realized I was the last to know, the only one left standing in the shadow of her decisions. Every memory of laughter, intimacy, and shared dreams now felt tainted, as if she had removed the meaning from them in order to justify her escape. By midnight, I had made a tentative decision to take control where I still could. Even though everything tangible had been taken, I could protect myself, my identity, and my future. I needed to disentangle myself from the life she had built around her departure, reclaim whatever dignity I could, and prepare to rebuild. It was a bitter realization that she had already moved forward, fully invested in her freedom, while I was left behind to process the devastation. But it was also a turning point, the moment I recognized that my recovery would start with acceptance of the truth, however painful it was. The morning she left, I stayed in the apartment, sitting on the edge of the couch, staring at the bare kitchen table where the documents had been. It was strange how quickly a home could feel alien, how familiar walls could transform into a museum of betrayal. Every room echoed with memories of laughter, arguments, and quiet moments that now seemed hollow, like echoes of someone else's life. I kept thinking about the flight she had booked, the passport she had hidden, the way she had executed every step without my knowledge. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. She had made me invisible in the most most literal way possible, and the weight of that realization pressed down hard. I called a few friends, trying to process the storm of emotions that raged inside me. Explaining the situation was exhausting. Even the people who cared about me struggled to grasp how methodical and total the betrayal had been. I described how she had sold the apartment, transferred the car, and emptied the bank accounts. Each detail I shared made it feel more real, more final. There was no turning back. Friends offered support, advice, and sympathy, but nothing could shield me from the profound sense of loss. I felt like I had been living in a shared reality that was entirely one-sided, like a character in a story whose co-author had suddenly rewritten the ending without warning. Days turned into weeks. I went through the motions of daily life, but each task felt heavier, each conversation tinged with the bitterness of absence. Every time my phone rang, I flinched, expecting a message from her with some explanation or justification, but the silence was absolute. She had crossed a line, severed ties, and moved on, leaving me with memories and legal documents that confirmed her meticulous planning. I started organizing the apartment, putting away personal belongings, separating what was mine from what had been hers. It was a painful exercise, like dissecting a life I thought was mutual and realizing it had never truly been shared. I contacted a lawyer to see if any of the transfers could be challenged, but the advice was grim. Legally, everything she had done was airtight. There was no fraud, no coercion, no loophole that I could exploit. The only option was to accept what had been lost and focus on rebuilding my own life. That realization was like a punch to the gut. She hadn't just taken our shared property, she had rewritten the rules of our relationship, and I had to learn to live within the reality she had created. I felt anger, disbelief, and grief, sometimes all at once, as I processed the enormity of the situation. During this time, I discovered small things that deepened my sense of betrayal. Emails she had deleted, messages she had cleared, small agreements we had made about purchases and bills. All of it was carefully erased from our shared history. It became clear that she hadn't just acted impulsively, she had orchestrated every step with precision. I kept thinking back to the countless times she had reassured me, smiled at me, and made promises about our future. Each memory now carried a shadow, a hidden truth I had been blind to for too long. I began seeking support in unexpected ways. I joined a small local group of people who had experienced similar betrayals, not romantic infidelity, but financial and emotional erasure by partners. Talking to people who understood the combination of shock, grief, and anger helped me feel less isolated. Their stories mirrored mine in unsettling ways, and yet, hearing how they had rebuilt their lives gave me a faint sense of hope. I realized that while Hannah had controlled the past, I still had control over the future. Slowly, I started creating a plan to regain stability. I reviewed my finances, found temporary housing options, and began applying for jobs in a city where she had no influence. Each step, though mundane, felt like reclaiming a piece of agency I had lost. The process was painstaking, and often I wanted to scream or cry, but I forced myself to move forward, one action at a time. I couldn't undo what she had done, but I could build something new, something resilient, that belonged entirely to me. One night, while packing what little remained from our shared belongings, I found a photograph tucked in the back of a drawer, us on a beach, laughing under the sun, carefree and happy. The image struck me with a wave of melancholy and anger. It was a reminder of what had been and what she had discarded so easily. I held it for a long time, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. That photograph and all the memories it represented couldn't be taken from me entirely. They were part of my history, my growth, and my understanding of who I was. By the end of the month, I had begun to establish routines that didn't include her presence. Routines that were practical, necessary, and emotionally stabilizing. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, threw myself into work, and began imagining a future unshaped by her decisions. Slowly, I felt a sense of clarity that had been absent since the moment I discovered the documents. I was grieving, yes, but I was also learning that survival didn't require her approval or involvement. I could rebuild, redefine, and reclaim my life entirely on my own terms. The weeks after Hannah left were a blur of practicalities and emotional upheaval. I had to disentangle myself from the remnants of a life that no longer existed, a life she had carefully dismantled without me. There were phone calls with banks, property agencies, and legal advisors, each one a reminder of her meticulous planning. The apartment felt like a hollow shell, echoing with memories I could no longer inhabit in the same way. Every corner reminded me of what we had shared and how completely she had erased my involvement. The familiarity of the space now carried an eerie, oppressive weight, forcing me to confront the reality of her betrayal again and again. I spent hours each day reviewing finances, re-establishing accounts in my name alone, and separating what belonged to me from the things she had liquidated. Even these mundane tasks carried emotional weight. Every document, every cleared account, every transfer was a reminder that the life we had built together was gone. But there was also a strange sense of empowerment in reclaiming what I could. Each small victory, a reinstated account, a replacement car lease, a new insurance plan, felt like a piece of agency I had been denied for so long. Slowly, I began to feel the first real sense of control I had experienced since the moment I discovered the signed documents. Friends became my anchor during this period. I leaned on people I trusted, sharing fragments of the story and receiving support without judgment. A close friend, Mark, helped me move the remaining furniture to a temporary apartment, and the physical act of packing and lifting helped helped ease the mental strain. Conversations that once seemed impossible became manageable as I voiced the hurt, disbelief, and anger I felt. These discussions helped me contextualize the betrayal. It wasn't a personal failing on my part, it was a choice she made, deliberate and unilateral, that had nothing to do with my worth. Understanding this distinction became central to my recovery. I also began seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma related to personal and financial betrayal. It was hard at first, recounting events in detail, acknowledging the depth of manipulation and control she had exerted, and confronting the sense of powerlessness that had taken hold. But it was transformative. Through these sessions, I learned to separate the act of betrayal from my identity, to see myself not as a victim, but as someone who had endured, who was capable of reclaiming control and rebuilding a life that had been disrupted by another person's actions. The emotional work was just as important as the practical, and it gradually allowed me to stop reliving the shock on a constant loop. Months passed, and I started imagining a future unencumbered by Hannah's shadow. I found a small apartment downtown, modest but entirely my own. Moving in brought a symbolic sense of freedom. For the first time in years, every corner, every wall, every piece of furniture reflected my choices and my control. I began to redecorate, to make the space a place where I could rebuild my identity, to reclaim both the physical and emotional territory she had stripped away. Each small addition, a new painting, a chair I chose for comfort, a plant that required care, became a marker of resilience. Rebuilding my social life also became essential. I reconnected with friends who had drifted during my relationship, those who had offered support before but whom I hadn't fully engaged with in months or years. Even casual outings, coffees, and dinners became exercises in reclaiming my emotional stability. I started dating again, tentatively at first, careful to choose people who demonstrated transparency, communication, and shared values. It was a slow process, fraught with insecurity and lingering mistrust, but each positive interaction helped chip away at the cynicism that had taken root after the betrayal. At work, I threw myself into projects with renewed focus. Hannah's departure had left me feeling unmoored, but I discovered that productivity, structure, and achievement could provide a sense of purpose and self-worth. Colleagues noticed the shift in my demeanor. I was calmer, more deliberate, more assertive. My ability to handle the professional world with poise mirrored the emotional control I was cultivating in my personal life. I realized that while she had tried to erase me from our shared history, she could not take away the skills, knowledge, and resilience I had accumulated over the years. Even holidays, which once carried echoes of shared plans, began to feel different. I celebrated in smaller, more intentional ways, surrounding myself with friends and family who were present, supportive, and genuine. I learned to find joy in the moments I could control, in relationships that were reciprocal rather than conditional, and in routines that reflected my priorities rather than someone else's secret agendas. The process of redefining happiness became crucial, no longer tied to what I had lost, but instead built on what I could create. The sense of closure was gradual. I didn't have a confrontation, a dramatic reckoning, or a legal reversal. Instead, closure arrived quietly in the moments when I realized I could enjoy a morning coffee without thinking about her, when I could make plans for the weekend without calculating her reactions, when I could laugh with friends without an echo of betrayal coloring it. It was a slow, internal process, the realization that my life no longer depended on someone who had deliberately excluded me from our shared reality. I had survived, and more importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self. Months turned into a year, and life continued forward. I met people who valued honesty, mutual respect, and transparency. I nurtured friendships and began a relationship with someone who communicated openly, whose intentions were clear, and whose presence was consistent. Each day felt like a small victory against the memory of betrayal. I came to understand that the power she had wielded, the ability to erase me from her plans, was temporary, limited by my willingness to rebuild. By prioritizing my agency and reclaiming my life, I had ensured that no one could repeat the same act against me. In the end, the discovery of the documents on the kitchen table, the shock, and the betrayal became a turning point. It marked the moment when my life, as I had known it, ended, but it also marked the beginning of a life entirely my own. I learned that control over one's future is built through action, resilience, and boundaries. While I still think about Hannah occasionally, it's no longer with anger, but with acknowledgement of a reality I cannot change, paired with gratitude for the strength I found in moving forward. I realized that life can be rebuilt even after calculated betrayal, and that independence, self-respect, and authentic relationships are far more valuable than any shared property or false promise.